Next presentation will be from Mr. C. Joseph Doyle. Those of you who were at the conference 2 years ago will remember his presentation at that time. Lively, wonderful, historical presentation. He is executive director of the Catholic Action League of Massachusetts. He's talking to us this evening about great Catholic statesmen of the 20th century. It may sound almost like an oxymoron, except, of course, that we had men like Franco and Salazar and Emperor Karl and Engelbert Dollfuss and Éamon de Valera. There were great Catholic statesmen in the 20th century, and Mr. Doyle is going to remind us of that, and I'm sure he's going to do so with much wit and brilliance. Please welcome to the podium Mr. Joseph Doyle.
First of all, let me just say how delighted I am to be here this evening, and I'm very grateful to Brother Francis and to Doug Bursaw for inviting me. The St. Benedict Center is an island of sanity in an otherwise confused world and confused, sadly, church of our day. It has been just 30 summers ago, the summer of 1972, that I first came to the center with the late State Representative Jim Craven and the late Bob Flanagan and Joe McIsaac, who is thankfully still very much with us here today. And I'm just very, very delighted, as I said, to be here. And it's a particular source of pleasure to see Brother Francis in the audience, who has been to this order and to its founder such an exemplary model of fidelity, and has been to the rest of us such a generous fountain of Catholic wisdom. You know, since the events of September 11th of 2001, there has been a renewed interest in a very great Catholic historian, Hilary Belloc, who is called English because he was, after all, he lived in England and worked in England and wrote in England, was actually a member of Parliament. But you should know his father was French and his mother was Irish. Anyways, this renewed interest in Belloc stems from his prophetic remarks more than 70 years ago that Islam, Mohammedanism, more precisely, would be the next great threat to the Christian culture of the West. And you not only find Catholic pundits and writers and journalists like Pat Buchanan mentioning Belloc now, but even in the larger secular society, people are mentioning Belloc's very interesting and very far-sighted analysis of the clash of civilizations. You may be interested in knowing where Belloc actually said that. He said that in a wonderful little book published in 1929 called Survivals and New Arrivals, which was a story of the different attacks on the faith throughout history. But he also wrote in that book, in the introduction to it, something that I think is very relevant to this conference tonight, because this conference that we're having actually this weekend is about Catholic saints and Catholic heroes. And what Belloc wrote about was how difficult it is for Catholics in the English-speaking world to fully appreciate and comprehend some of our heroes and some of our great models and great saints and great contributors to Catholic culture and history. And he talks about how there is a Catholic culture in Europe, and there is also a non-Catholic culture in Europe, but even in the non-Catholic culture in Europe, they can still perceive and comprehend and appreciate Catholic culture, because that culture in many cases is nearby. It's people of the same ethnicity, the same race, the same language, such as the Catholics of Germany or the Catholics of Switzerland or the Catholics of the Netherlands, who have lived in an historically Protestant-dominated society, but still are capable of grasping and perceiving Catholic culture. He mentions, however, that in the English-speaking world, in Great Britain, in the United States, in the countries of the British Commonwealth, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, it's particularly difficult to appreciate Catholic saints and heroes. And he says this is the case because there Catholicism re-entered late as an alien phenomenon after the nature of society had already been set in an anti-Catholic mold. And he goes on to say that there, meaning in the English-speaking world here, that is to say, in Britain and America, in the UK and the US and elsewhere, there all the national literature, traditions, law, and especially history were and are fundamentally anti-Catholic. All the philosophy of society was long settled in the anti-Catholic mood before the first recrudescence of Catholicism appeared. And he goes on to say, therefore, it's inevitable that the Catholic body within the English-speaking world should breathe an air which is not its own, and should be more affected by a non-Catholic or even an anti-Catholic spirit than could be possible in other Protestant nations where an ancient Catholic culture exists with an unbroken tradition. And he mentions that another effect is the comparative lack of sympathy, politically at least, between these Catholic minorities and the great bodies of Catholic culture abroad. And talking about England, and by extension America, and talking about the study of history and the study of Catholic statesmen, which we're going to talk about tonight, he said that the past, especially the remote past, is another world to them. And he said all the belauding of the breakup of Christendom in the 16th century, and this is a marvelous bit of Catholic literature right here, all the belauding of the breakup of Christendom in the 16th century, all the taking for granted of its political consequence as a good thing, all the denunciation of our champions, all the flattery of our worst enemies, all the sneers at the nations which kept the faith, all the admiration of the princes and politicians who destroyed it are absorbed by us in books by which we are bred. A ridicule and a hatred for the later Stuarts at home, of Louis XIV abroad, a respect at least for the House of Orange, an insistence on the decline of Spain. All this and the whole mass of English letters train us in special pleading against the faith. Nor have we, in England at least, any bulk of true history as yet to counteract this flood of propaganda. He goes on to say the Catholic Church has then, in the English-speaking world, with which readers and this writer of this book are principally concerned, advantages and disadvantages. It is badly cut off from the general Catholic world outside. It is permeated by an anti-Catholic literature, social custom, and history. And he says, on the other hand, it reacts upon the hostile atmosphere and perceives, though dimly, some of its inherent superiorities, notably in clarity of thought and in a determined philosophy. And he says, the truth here, I emphasize, is unpalatable. Most of us are only half aware, or becoming less aware with every added decade, that the air we breathe is anti-Catholic, that the history we are taught, the moral ideas behind the legal system we obey, the restrictions imposed on us, the political conceptions embodied in every public act, the general attitude towards foreign countries, all are the products of that nationalism which their non-Catholic fellow citizens regard as the sacred emotion. But we cannot ourselves be filled with that emotion, but it is spiritually at issue with the faith. Think of that now, today, in terms of the attitudes of so many Catholics here. Think of the shameful imitation of the prejudices of their oppressors that so many Irish American Catholics have developed in terms of their attitude towards the Latin culture of the West, towards Latin Catholic countries like France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and the countries of Latin America. Think about the tendency of some Irish Americans, even very conservative ones, to consider as admirable political characters like Margaret Thatcher, who left 11 Irish Catholics to die on hunger strike and who attacked a Catholic country, Argentina. Think of the tendency of conservatives, even conservative Catholics, to applaud the state of Israel when it invades an historically Catholic country like Lebanon, and when it draws no distinction in the disabilities and the persecution it imposes, whether it's on the Muslim majority or the Catholic minority in Palestine. Think of all the different ways in which Catholics do not think like Catholics and do not act like Catholics and do not make political judgments on the basis of their great Catholic faith and culture. So Belloc is relevant today as much as he was in 1929 when he wrote these words. So I'd like to talk a little bit tonight about some of the great Catholic statesmen, and so we can understand that we of the true faith also have a very rich culture in the temporal order and in the political world of very great statesmen, very great leaders, very great heroes that applied Catholic principles that are examples of heroism and of fidelity and of integrity in their public life. Now, one I'd like to start with, and I hope you won't think it's merely a matter of chauvinistic loyalty, though I understand there are some Catholics of Irish descent in Massachusetts, is Éamon de Valera. A few years ago, Hollywood made a movie entitled by the name of Michael Collins, which was broadly greeted by the Irish American community and many Catholics as a great story of Ireland's heroic struggle for independence from Great Britain. Perhaps that overly generous reaction was the result of so much starvation in the past, when Hollywood, of course, being entirely corrupt, has ignored stories of Catholic heroism. But the more discerning Irish Americans and the more discerning Catholics saw that for all of the violence depicted from events of 80 years ago in this movie. The real violence of the movie was the assassination carried out on the character of one of the great, as I said, Catholic statesmen of the 20th century, Éamon de Valera. Now, the makers of this film, which was apparently a very popular hit, denied this. However, as we all know, Hollywood actors are persons of multiple opinions but limited intelligence. And the so-called star of the film, Liam Neeson, inadvertently let the cat out of the bag. In an interview with the Boston Herald of all newspapers, he said that he was very pleased with this movie because it showed how one man, Éamon de Valera, tried to create a closed, intolerant Catholic society in Ireland, and we are now moving beyond that. Right? So the hatred of the faith is always there. And by the way, you can always tell the Catholic statesmen, Francisco Franco, Éamon de Valera, James Michael Curley here in America, 25, 30, 50 years after they're dead, they're still hated by the world. It's not an absolutely infallible measurement of their abilities and of their Catholic loyalties, but it's generally a very good one. And if secular society despises someone who was a Catholic leader of the past, you can generally be inclined at least to give him a favorable hearing. By the way, modern society not only despises de Valera, particularly modern Irish society, which is becoming increasingly post-Christian, secular, and Anglophile. Not only does Catholic society, or the society of Catholic intelligentsia in this country and elsewhere, despise him because of his what is viewed as his archaic and again intolerant Catholicism, but the English despised him and continue to despise him. And we can judge by some of their remarks the character of this man. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, whose unparalleled record as a notorious public liar remains unchallenged despite a recent American presidency, said of de Valera that it was dealing with him was like trying to pick up mercury with a fork. And he went on to say that on the floor of the House of Commons that Éamon de Valera was entirely unique, and the poor, distracted world should be very grateful of that fact. Winston Churchill continually opposed and attacked de Valera. In fact, in his famous victory speech on VE Day, May 8, 1945, he actually spent more time criticizing de Valera than he did Hitler or Mussolini. Stanley Baldwin, the appeaser, the man who Churchill viewed as the prime minister most responsible for the disarmament of Britain, said that de Valera was impossible to deal with. His successor, another appeaser, Neville Chamberlain, who did have better relations with Ireland, said dealing with Mr. de Valera is rather like dealing with Herr Hitler. And their predecessor, Ramsay MacDonald, the first socialist prime minister, was even more fulsome. He said that talking about de Valera's negotiating style, he said he starts about the time of Jesus Christ, and after 3 hours is up to Brian Boru. Makes one quite sick. Anyways, de Valera is generally portrayed as intransigent and obstinate and unreasonable by the British. Many years later, when he was president of Ireland, after serving many years as prime minister, in 1963 he was visited by the president of the United States, John F. Kennedy. And the authors of the book, Johnny, We Hardly Knew You, two of Kennedy's aides, David Powers and Kenneth O'Donnell, wrote of a conversation between de Valera and Kennedy, in which this issue was raised about de Valera's alleged intransigence in talking about in his relations with Great Britain. And de Valera, supposedly, according to the authors, told Kennedy that far from being intransigent, he was the only person who really knew how to deal with the British. He said that if you're weak, the British will intimidate you. If you're vain, the British will flatter you. If you're reasonable, the British will cajole you. So he said the best way of dealing with the British is to toss a few bombs under their lorries just to tell them that you're as reasonable as they are. Éamon de Valera was born not in Ireland, but in Brooklyn, New York, in October of 1882, the son of a Spanish father and an Irish mother. And he said proudly that he came from solid Catholic stock, ancient and solid Catholic stock on both sides. His father died when he was very young, and his mother was unable to support him, so he was sent to live with his mother's relations in Ireland. And he was sent off just before his father's relations from Cuba arrived to their discomfort and to the eternal benefit of Fidel Castro, who would never have to deal with him again. Anyways, he was raised in Ireland. He was raised in Ennis, in County Clare, near the border, not far from Limerick, in perhaps one of the most Catholic, one of the most traditional, one of the most conservative, one of the most agricultural, rural parts of Ireland. De Valera, when asked many years later how he judges Irish public opinion or how he would judge the Irish character, would said that having given his upbringing and given his background, he merely had to look into his own heart to find out what the Irish people were thinking. That was not entirely pretension on his part. It was he was someone that was profoundly representative of the Catholic culture from which he sprang. De Valera was a child of extraordinary intelligence, and despite the poverty of the family, received an education paid for by the church, and ended up as a teacher in a Catholic school, Blackrock College. You know, in Ireland and Britain, a college refers to a secondary school, to high school. He was a professor of mathematics, and there he learned of not only the Catholicism of Ireland, of scholars and saints and of martyrs, but of the larger, broader Catholicism of Europe, the Catholicism of kings and emperors, and of great Catholic states and nations. He was an early and ardent Irish nationalist and a great believer in the Irish language. By the way, his support for the Irish language, Irish Gaelic, you know, there are 6 Gaelic languages, Breton, Cornish, Welsh, and then the other 3, Scottish, Irish, and Manx. His great support for the Irish language was not merely sentimental or even historical. It was very practical. He felt that so long as Ireland was an English-speaking country, it would be dominated by the British press and the British media and British ideas and British conceptions. He thought English was a Protestant language, and there is some truth to that. So he was a great supporter of the Irish language and, of course, of Irish independence. He joined the mainstream nationalist Irish volunteers in 1913. Now, at this point in time, repeated efforts at peaceful constitutional change had failed. The House of Commons turned down a Home Rule Bill in 1886. It was passed in 1893, but then overturned, vetoed by the House of Lords, nominated by members of the peerage and also by bishops of the Church of England. And the movement in Ireland had then been towards, therefore, physical force nationalism. So he joined the Irish volunteers, trained with them, was eventually, because of his talent and his intelligence, invited to join the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was the predecessor to the IRA, which, like De Valera, was born in Brooklyn, not in 1882, but in 1857, again, of Irish exiles. Because of his Catholicism, there was some difficulty in him joining the IRB because the bishops had condemned oath-bound sacred societies, so the IRB gave him something of an exception. He was able to take the Irish Republican Brotherhood oath, but with the stipulation that it would not in any way interfere with his religious duties as a Catholic. He was among those involved in the planning of the Great Easter Rising of 1916, which may have actually succeeded in liberating the entire country had not at the last minute the head of the Irish Volunteers, Professor Owen McNeill, decided against it and called it off, and as a result, you had a great sacrifice of men in Dublin, but the rest of Ireland did not rise with them, and the ultimate issue was doomed. De Valera scouted out the positions that he would defend in the Rising on Easter Sunday. He took his son with him, walking around Dublin, so that he would not be conspicuous, and then went to confession, believing that he would die the next day. On Easter Monday, he commanded the IRA forces, the Irish Volunteer Forces, at Boland's Mill, and it was in the area of his command, of his jurisdiction as one of the commandants of the Rising, that the largest number of British casualties were inflicted. An entire British rifle battalion, about 750 men, were sent against De Valera's sharpshooters. The British took in excess of 50% casualties. He was the last IRA commandant to surrender. Now, you may recall that since Great Britain was then in the middle of the First World War, and many Irish Catholics were serving in British armed forces, the initial Easter Rising in Dublin for Irish independence was actually very unpopular among perhaps, if not the mass of the Irish people, certainly the mass of people in Dublin, who suffered greatly when the British brought in warships to shell the city and brought in more troops to occupy it and committed various atrocities. That public opinion changed, however, with the decision of the British government to execute the leaders of the Rising. And in an incredibly obtuse, ham-fisted example of poor public relations, they actually allowed photographs to be taken during the execution of James Connolly, who was the head of the Citizen Army. And James Connolly had been badly wounded in the General Post Office and was executed by a firing squad while sitting in his wheelchair. So the British, again, at the height of the First World War, were not sensitive to world public opinion and paid for it. They also paid for it in Ireland because public opinion in Ireland changed watching the various executions going on in Kilmainham jail. Now, De Valera, some believe De Valera was not executed along with the other leaders of the Easter Rising because he was an American citizen, having been born in Brooklyn, and because at 1916 Britain desperately wanted the United States to come into the war and rescue them, and would not be so so completely counterproductive and so completely devoid of common sense as to execute a prominent American, prominent person of American heritage and American citizenship who was fighting for Ireland. There is some evidence that the British had made, because of the public relations backfire, had already made the decision to stop the executions. But in any case, De Valera survived and was not executed along with the other commandants. Now, this is a very, very key point in the story of Éamon de Valera. It was the British executions of 1916 that, quite unintentionally on the part of the British, inadvertently propelled the man who would be their worst enemy into the leadership of Ireland. James Connolly, who was a very great patriot, was a socialist urban trade union leader in a predominantly rural, Catholic, conservative country. Patrick Pearse, the other leader of the Rising, was a poet. At least a couple of members of the various commandants, of the signatories, had, let us say, a critical posture vis-a-vis the church. De Valera, on the other hand, came, as I said, from the heart of the Irish countryside, was a conservative Catholic, was somebody whose whole temper and outlook, whose ideology, whose philosophy, and whose spirituality, whose faith, was completely in keeping with the then popular mood of the Irish people. You know, the Irish people had not always been the great Catholic people that we think of now. There was a great devotional revolution, as it was called, in the 19th century under the leadership of Paul Cardinal Cullen. Many Irish in the era going up to the famine had, if not, they had not lost their faith, but they were somewhat indifferent in its practice. It was the horrible atrocity, the horrible suffering of the great hunger. And we really shouldn't call it a famine because there was no shortage of food. The British were actually exporting food out of the country. But it was, in many ways, a contrived catastrophe. But the Irish actually developed their reputation as very, very pious Catholics in the second half of the 19th century. And many, even Protestant non-Catholic historians now today admit that one of the reasons Ireland became an independent country was because of the solidarity and the militancy and the vigor that that was reinstilled in Irish life by this great devotional revolution that caused a revival of Catholicism. Anyways, De Valera was very much part of the devotional revolution and very much part of the Catholic life of Ireland. And here, someone who could embody the spirit of the Irish people, who could embody the aspirations of the Irish people, and who could represent them effectively, was now, in effect, by the British execution of everyone else, propelled into the leadership of the Irish nationalist movement. Arthur Griffith stepped aside to allow De Valera to become the president of Sinn Féin at the beginning of 1917. De Valera was elected a member of the British Parliament from Clare in 1917, and in accordance with Sinn Féin principle, became an abstentionist. IRA members and Sinn Féin supporters would refuse to take any oath of allegiance to the British Crown, so they would be elected to Parliament but would refuse to take their seats. De Valera was eventually, in 1919, when the elected representatives of Ireland met and declared their independence, De Valera was elected president of the first Doyle, which is to say the first Irish the Continental Congress, so to speak, and in effect president of the Irish Republic. It should be remembered, by the way, that Ireland freely, in the last all-Ireland election, North and South in 1918, Ireland freely and overwhelmingly chose independence from Great Britain. Of the 73 seats in the Irish Parliament, some 57 ended up going to Sinn Féin members, and 6 more went to other nationalist parties who joined Sinn Féin. So there was, in terms of the number of seats, you ended up with something in the order of 80% of the Irish people ended up voting for candidates who favored independence. And the British response, of course, was to partition the country. Apparently an 80% majority is insufficient for national independence in the days of the British Empire. Anyways, De Valera became the president of the Irish government, which functioned clandestinely as the country was still under British occupation. And from 1919 to 1921, pardon me, from January of 1919 to the middle of June of 1921, there was a war of independence where guerrilla tactics by the Irish Republican Army made British government of Ireland essentially impossible. The Irish understood they did not have the physical resources to expel the British Army and a 120,000-man garrison, so they practiced guerrilla warfare to make the country ungovernable. They also understood that spies, traitors, and informers were to be held more dangerous than British soldiers or policemen, and therefore concentrated their efforts at blinding British intelligence by drying up their sources, by executing people who they viewed correctly as traitors to their country. De Valera went overseas looking for support. He came here to Massachusetts, to Boston. He stayed on Mission Hill. He spoke at Mechanics Hall, where the Prudential Center stands nowadays. And it was there, by the way, that he first unveiled the modern Irish flag, the tricolor. He went to New York and Chicago and spent much time raising the Irish National Loan, the fund to help support Irish independence. Meanwhile, in Ireland, Michael Collins and others carried on a relentless guerrilla war against the British. One sympathizer, one historian quite sympathetic to the British, and Scottish historian Robert Townsend, said that the British decided to get out of Ireland because they realized, that a British officer realized, he could not walk out of his club in Dublin without danger of being assassinated, and they could not travel from Dublin to Cork unless they did so by torpedo boat, destroyer, or by aircraft. They could not travel on the surface because Ireland was now so dangerous. A compromise peace ensued. Pardon me. The British were unwilling to recognize Irish independence. They had been unwilling to grant Irish home rule. Then they were unwilling to recognize dominion status, that is to say, Ireland retaining the British monarchy and remaining a member of the British Commonwealth, but having its own independence. And now, of course, what the IRA and Sinn Féin aspired to was complete independence in an Irish republic, and the British refused to recognize this. In the negotiations which followed, De Valera sent Michael Collins, who had been the chief of Irish intelligence, to Britain with other members of his government to negotiate a peace. The peace treaty was essentially flawed. It resulted in two very serious compromises. One is Ireland would not be a republic, it would be a dominion of the British Empire. There would be something called the Irish Free State, like the Orange Free State in South Africa. And that would be something in which the King of Great Britain would remain the head of state, and it would remain within the Commonwealth, and there would be various constrictions on its national sovereignty. Now, today, you know, we think of Canada and Australia as having nothing more than essentially a kind of titular relationship to Great Britain. But in those days, dominion status was much more subordinate. Sister, very thoughtful and farsighted of you. Thank you. Foreign policy was entirely an imperial prerogative then. If Ottawa wanted to talk to Washington, they had to go through London. In terms of judicial matters, the British House of Lords and the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council was the Supreme Court of the British Empire, and you can actually appeal against your own government to London. There were a whole variety of defense constraints on. And in Ireland, it was more. This treaty provided that Ireland should have no navy, that Ireland should have a complete free trade zone with Britain, which other dominions did not have. But most of all, it also mandated the partition of Ireland into two separate states on the theory that there was a Protestant majority in the north. That's not true. Northern Ireland is not a majority Protestant state. It's a classic, flagrant, textbook example of a gerrymander. Anyone can create a majority by drawing a line on a map, and the British did so. They took a 19% national minority, and they gerrymandered them into a position as a regional majority. By the way, when the Turks did this in Cyprus recently in the 1970s and took about an 18% national minority and gave them 40% of Cyprus, the entire world condemned it. They refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Turkish Cypriot state. There are no countries, there are no Western countries that have diplomatic relations with Turkish Cyprus. Turkey is the only country that has diplomatic relations with it. Yet in Ireland's case, where the British did exactly the same thing, it was greeted with largely universal indifference. By the way, there are 6 counties in Northern Ireland. At least 4 of them, have Catholic majorities. And that they included vast areas that were contiguous with the Irish Republic, contiguous with the Irish Free State that had Catholic majorities, such as Fermanagh and Tyrone, South Down, South Armagh, Derry City, and Newry. Now, there are two reasons why we believe the British did that. One is the cynical reason, and the other is the very cynical reason. The cynical reason is that the British, being greedy imperialists, wanted to keep as much as they can get away with and get away with as much as they could keep. The very cynical reason is that the British did not want a homogeneously Protestant Northern Ireland. Let me repeat that. The British didn't want a homogeneously Protestant Northern Ireland. They wanted a Protestant and Catholic Northern Ireland, so their classic divide et impera, divide and rule technique that they used in India, that they used in Palestine, that they used elsewhere, could be had here. Sir James Craig, Lord Craigavon, who was the first Protestant Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, actually asked for dominion status at one point, that Northern Ireland would become a separate state like Canada or like Ireland or like Australia. And Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, Lloyd George was the Prime Minister, Churchill was the Colonial Secretary, basically told him to shut up and sit down and stop asking impertinent questions of His Majesty's government. The British wanted the two cats in a bag, the two cats in a bag theory. The British wanted the Catholics and the Protestants to fight so as to preserve their rule over the North. Anyways, de Valera dissented from the treaty. It was passed narrowly by the Irish Doyle. Catholic hierarchy strongly endorsed it. De Valera made a very famous remark at the time that in our era where we uncritically accept all of the pretensions of what is called democracy, he said the majority have no right to commit treason. The majority have no right to commit treason. He resigned as president and went into opposition. There was a 2-year civil war in Ireland from a year and a half, actually, from the beginning of 1922 to the fall of 1923, in which Republican forces were defeated and the Irish Free State, that is to say the state that was set up under British auspices, prevailed. Now, de Valera now went into what you might call his political wilderness years. There was some question about his status at this point as a Catholic, insofar as the hierarchy had actually pronounced an excommunication against anyone who bore arms against the new Irish Free State. De Valera, it seems, various priests offered de Valera the sacraments. He turned them down simply because he did not want to endanger the status of the priest or put the priest in a bad conscience with his bishop for possibly being disobedient. Eventually, this excommunication became a dead letter, became moot, and Irish Republicans were able to return to the regular practice of the faith. In 1926, de Valera split with the other members of Sinn Féin as opposition to form Fianna Fáil, the Soldiers of Destiny Party, and entered the Irish Free State Parliament, but refused to take any oath of allegiance to the Crown. By 1932, his strength was such that he was able to actually come to power. Now, we have a phrase today called result democracy, where great powers give lip service to the notion of democracy, but only support it if there's the right result. The 1932 election in Ireland is a great example of result democracy. The British were so alarmed by de Valera coming to power, somebody of profoundly Catholic spirit coming to power, that they actually set up a special situation committee comprised of the Prime Minister and other top ministers to monitor the results and see if they could undo the result. The British actually attempted to get certain forces in the Irish Army and the Irish police to mount a coup against de Valera. This would be, there would be a double benefit for the British here. First of all, they would get rid of their enemy, Éamon de Valera. Second of all, they would discredit Ireland. They would say, see, we gave independence to Ireland and they could not even maintain a democratic representative constitutional government. To the credit of the people they attempted to seduce and suborn, they refused to become agents of Ireland's hereditary enemy. De Valera was in a very difficult position. Some Irish Republicans at this point criticized him for not moving more quickly for the establishment of an Irish Republic. But he had very, very difficult position that he had to deal with. One is he did not have a majority government, he had a minority. He had a Senate that was entirely controlled by Protestants and Unionists and by his political opposition. He could not be sure of the loyalty of his own army and police force, who had been his opponents in the Civil War 10 years before. And of course, he had to worry about the attitude of Great Britain. It had only been a few months since the Statute of Westminster passed, where the British recognized the independence of Commonwealth countries. The next few years are an example of the great skill of de Valera in terms of his nationalist leadership. He gradually weaned Ireland away from the British Commonwealth connection. He tore up, essentially, this compromise treaty with Great Britain. He dismantled the Irish Free State. He withdrew from the British Commonwealth. He abolished the British monarchy. He got rid of the office of Governor General. He got rid of this unionist puppet Senate. And he made Ireland a republic in all but name. Now, he did not officially proclaim Ireland a republic because, as he put it, he wanted to leave one last bridge for the northern unionists to walk over. And he allowed himself to have a very ambiguous, what he called an external association with the British Commonwealth. But he also did something else, which is of interest to us this evening. And that, of course, is his wonderful Constitution of 1937, which is one of the most profoundly Catholic political documents of this century, or perhaps of any time, and was inspired in large measure by papal social encyclicals, by Catholic social doctrine, by Catholic social justice teachings, by Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno, and remains, though in a somewhat mutilated form, his great legacy today. And I just wanted to take a moment to tell you a little bit about this Constitution. Now, we all know how the U.S. Constitution starts, our very eloquent preamble. Remember, what is it, Gladstone said it was the finest work of the human brain. In our Constitution, we say, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. Now, what's missing there? There's no reference to God. Let me tell you about de Valera's Constitution. This is how it begins. This is the preamble to de Valera's wonderful Irish Constitution of 1937. In the name of the most holy Trinity, from whom is all authority and to whom, as our final end, all actions both of men and states must be referred, we, the people of Ireland, humbly acknowledging our obligations to our divine Lord Jesus Christ, who sustained our fathers through century of trial, gratefully remembering their heroic and unremitting struggle to regain the rightful independence of our nation, and seeking to promote the common good with due observance of prudence, justice, and charity, so that the dignity and freedom of the individual may be assured, true social order attained, the unity of our country restored, and concord established with other nations, do hereby adopt and act and give to ourselves this Constitution. Marvelous Catholic document, in the name of the most holy Trinity. But that's not all that it says. Now again, this Constitution was inspired by Catholic social principles. And I want to read you something about the family that I think any American would envy today to have in our Constitution. We live in a time when the government can give your child contraceptives in a public school without your knowledge or consent, where they're exposed to radical sex education and AIDS education, where your child is exposed to gay, straight alliances and homosexual advocacy groups in public schools. This is what Éamon de Valera had to say about the family, and in effect embodied it in the Constitution of the, not as a law, not as a statute, as a provision of the Constitution of the Republic of Ireland. The state recognizes the family as the natural, primary, and fundamental unit group of society, and as a moral institution possessing inalienable and imprescriptible rights, antecedent and superior to all positive law, antecedent and superior to all positive law, prior and above all statute and all power of legislation. This is Catholic doctrine enshrined in a political document. The state therefore guarantees to protect the family in its constitution and authority, and is the necessary basis of social order, and is indispensable to the welfare of the nation and the state. Now, feminists, not that there are any here, will fall over. In particular, the state recognizes that by her life within the home, woman gives to the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved. The state shall therefore endeavor to ensure that mothers shall not be obligated by economic necessity to engage in labor to the neglect of their duties in the home. Then marriage, we live today in a country that has recognized civil unions, domestic partnerships, and is going toward same-gender marriage. The state pledges itself to guard with special care the institution of marriage on which the family is founded and to protect it against attack. And then, where it had been a statute in the Irish Free State, it's now a constitutional provision under de Valera. No law shall be enacted providing for the grant of a dissolution of marriage. No divorce in Ireland. Now, education. We all know that the Catholic Church teaches that not the state, but the parents are the primary educators of children. Article 42, the state acknowledges that the primary and natural educator of the child is the family, and guarantees to respect the inalienable right and duty of parents to provide according to their means for the religious and moral, intellectual, physical, and social education of children. Now, we live today where many people take a great burden on themselves to educate their children at home because of the dysfunctionalism and ideological coercion of our government's education monopoly. 60 years ago, de Valera wrote, parents shall be free to provide this education in their homes or in private schools or in schools recognized or established by the state. The state shall not oblige parents in violation of their conscience and lawful preference to send their children to schools established by the state or to any particular type of school designated by the state. This Constitution goes on to recognize the right of private property as a positive good at a time when it's under challenge by socialism, but also in keeping with Catholic social doctrine, to say that that the private property must be used for the good of society in accordance with the principles of social justice and the common good. And goes on to say that great concentrations of wealth are to be avoided, and that exploitation of one group or class by another is to be avoided. As for religion, Article 44, the state acknowledges that the homage of public worship is due to Almighty God. The state acknowledges that the homage of public worship is due to Almighty God. It shall hold his name in reverence and shall respect and honor religion. And then it goes on to say the state, and this is the same thing Napoleon put in his constitution, the state recognizes the special position of the Holy Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman Church as the guardian of the faith professed by the great majority of citizens. Toleration to Protestant churches and to the Jewish synagogue. And Father Fahey felt this was a denial of the social kingship of Christ. My own attitude is that de Valera probably made a prudential judgment here, given the fact that the the country was still divided. But I'm inclined to sympathize with Father Fahey on this point, simply because not only on Catholic grounds, but appeasement of the bigots in the North has never worked. And if this was a conciliation towards them, it made no difference. This, of course, Article 44 has since been repealed since the 1970s by the Irish government and the Irish electorate, because it was viewed as an obstacle 30 years ago to the unification of Ireland. As we know, Ireland has still not been unified. Still, this is a marvelous constitution, and it is the most profoundly, perhaps, and comprehensively Catholic constitution of the 20th century, and the one that endures, even in its somewhat diminished and mutilated form, and it remains De Valera's great legacy. Now, De Valera not only achieved the true independence of Ireland, where before Ireland had been, as I said, a dominion of the British Commonwealth, now it was a republic in all but name. But he kept Ireland neutral in the Second World War, and for this he's somewhat criticized in America and in the Western press. Now, we here in America had a War of 1812, which we viewed as, and some historians have called the Second War for American Independence. And the reason it's called that is because the British government resented American independence and refused to really accept the legitimacy of the American government, and continually violated our territorial integrity, our sovereignty, and our neutrality in the years between independence and 1812. And it was only with the War of 1812 that the British began to truly respect American rights. Irish neutrality may be, in the World War II, may be compared to the War of 1812. This was the final and genuine and ultimate example of Irish independence from Great Britain. In the First World War, perhaps as many as 300,000 Irish served in British and Indian and in Dominion armed forces. And Hilary Belloc makes the wonderful point that commercial states like Great Britain tend to be aristocracies. They tend to rely on maritime resources and naval power, and they tend to get other people to do their fighting for them. There was that infamous phrase after the terrible Battle of the Somme in the First World War, that England will fight to the last Canadian. And that applied not only to Canada, but to Ireland. If you watch some Australian cinema, many of their modern movies refer to this factor, like Gallipoli, or the movie they made about the South African War, the Boer War, which shows how the British were willing to sacrifice the young Australian men who attacked machine guns with their chests. Ireland was also this case, and for all throughout its history, had been a source of military labor, you might say, for Great Britain. Sir Henry Wilson, who was chief of the Imperial General Staff, the British equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, detested the Irish, talked about the rotten South Country Irish, but opposed Irish independence because he said, then we'll lose all the Irish battalions, we'll lose all the Irish regiments, and what will happen to our glorious old army? The British used the Irish as cannon fodder. De Valera refused to do so. The British tried to induce him, saying, we'll protect your cities from the Luftwaffe if the Luftwaffe attacks in World War II. Well, the British couldn't protect their own cities. Look what happened to Birmingham and London and Coventry and Liverpool and even Belfast. Ireland was a small country with the population of Greater Boston. It was defenseless. Its armed forces were the size of the Massachusetts National Guard. It had effectively no navy and no air force, no anti-aircraft capability. The Luftwaffe would have destroyed Dublin in World War II. It also would have resulted in untold Irish civilian casualties. Now, America was very critical of Ireland for its neutrality, and the American press attacked it, which is an irony, you might say, because America did not enter the Second World War until it itself was attacked. Ireland was never attacked, and therefore it chose not to enter the war, chose not to be a pawn of the British Empire. However, Irish sympathies and De Valera's personal sympathies were entirely with the Allied side. It was not a neutral neutrality. It was a neutrality favorable to the Allies. If a British or American pilot landed on Irish soil, he was put back in his airplane. If the plane was damaged, it was put on a flatbed trailer and taken to Northern Ireland. If a German flyer or a U-boat survivor landed on the Irish shore, he was interned. He was treated honorably. By the way, the Germans, many of the German internees refused to go back to Germany after the Second World War and lived in Ireland. The reason was the Irish really didn't have the facilities to lock them up, so they would feed them and keep them in this military camp, the Curragh, at night, but allow them to go out and work, since the Irish taxpayer couldn't be supporting these German internees, and go out and work during the day. And they also allowed them a few hours to go to the pub before they got back to the military camp. Needless to say, the prospect of returning to a battered, flattened, and impoverished Germany in 1945 was not very appealing to them, so most of them ended up marrying Irish girls and staying in Ireland. But De Valera was a Christian, and he treated them with Christian charity. He also, nonetheless, he allowed the Irish to volunteer for British forces. He would report the movements over clear channel airwaves of any U-boats that appeared, which could sink not only British ships but Irish ships and others. And it did many, many things to help the Allied cause in World War II, but did so discreetly and quietly, and was victimized for this by the Allied press and by the British and the American governments, because he could not defend himself. Because Ireland was neutral, he could not publicly state the things he was doing quietly to help the Allied cause defeat Hitler, so they were able to make these outrageous charges against him. Now, even historians who are hostile to De Valera point out that that much of the British and American propaganda towards him during the Second World War was intended to discredit him so as to put Ireland out of court on the partition issue when the war was over. The British representative in Ireland in World War II was Sir John Maffey, later Lord Rugby. The American representative was particularly hostile to De Valera. His name was David Gray. He was a personal friend of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. He was a Massachusetts Yankee. He was a Protestant. He was a Mason. And like many Anglo-Saxon Protestants of the late 19th and early 20th century, he was obsessed with this occultic and rather Luciferian thing called spiritualism, that is to say Ouija boards and seances and the rest. He despised De Valera. But he wrote very interestingly of De Valera that it was, again, very impossible to deal with him because he can't be tricked, he can't be deceived, he can't be flattered, he can't be intimidated, and he's wholly intransigent in the interest of his own country. They did everything possible to destroy him during the war. Churchill essentially tried to strangle Ireland in the Second World War as a punitive policy to punish it for its neutrality. In 1945, in April of 45, as the war was coming to an end, Hitler committed suicide on the 30th of April in his bunker in Berlin. Now, the British and American representatives in Dublin had been quite obnoxious to De Valera all during the war, and they did everything possible to discredit him and to try to remove him from power. Dr. Hempel, who was not a Nazi, who was the German representative, had been very correct towards De Valera and had done nothing to violate Irish neutrality. Given the obnoxiousness of the Allied representatives and the courtesy of Dr. Hempel, De Valera paid a courtesy call on the German embassy the day after Hitler's death and signed the condolence book. He did this as a courtesy to Hempel. There was a massive outrage in America, Britain, and even Ireland over this fact. And this, of course, prompted Churchill's famous May 8th, 1945 speech, where he talked about the necessity, perhaps, of coming to close quarters with Mr. De Valera, and the fact that Britain had restrained herself from invading Ireland, though apparently Ireland clearly deserved to be invaded, allegedly for her treachery towards the Allies, though again she was officially neutral. They felt they had discredited De Valera entirely, and that public opinion, even in his own country at this point, would turn against him. De Valera waited 4 days to respond to Mr. Churchill, but gave a masterly speech on Irish radio, which was broadcast all over the world, which had a profound effect, not only here in America, but particularly on public opinion in Ireland. Let me just tell you a few of the things that De Valera said. He said, Mr. Churchill makes it clear in certain circumstances that he would have violated our neutrality and that he would justify his action by Britain's necessity. It seems strange to me that Mr. Churchill does not see that this, if accepted, would mean that Britain's necessity would become a moral code, and when this necessity became sufficiently great, other people's rights were not to count. He said, Mr. Churchill is proud of Britain's stand alone and after France had fallen and before America entered the war. Could he not find it in his heart the generosity to acknowledge that there is another small nation that stood alone, not for 1 year or two, but for several hundred years against aggression, that endured spoliation, famine, massacres in endless succession, that was clubbed many times into insensibility, but that each time on returning to consciousness took up the fight anew, a small nation that we never got to accept defeat and has never surrendered her soul. De Valera was mobbed by the citizens of Dublin when he came out of the Radio Éireann studios. And the British diplomats and the American diplomats and the Canadian diplomats complained we had his head on a plate. And now Churchill, because of his intemperate remarks, provoked this response. De Valera remained in power for 16 years from 1932 to 1948, came back again from 1951 to 54, and again from 57 to 59, when he was elected president, a titular position in the Irish Republic, and served 2 terms as president from 1959 to 1973. He was 90 years old when he retired from the presidency of Ireland. When he moved into the presidential residence in Ireland, which is Al, perhaps you could tell me, it's the formal Viceregal Lodge, isn't it, in Dublin, the old, in Phoenix Park, he had a chapel installed with the Blessed Sacrament, and he visited the Blessed Sacrament at least 5 times a day. We may surmise, perhaps, that he recited the Divine Office. He was a practicing Catholic, who was frequently a daily communicant in much of his life. He died 2 years after leaving office, and in August, just this month, I think it was August the 29th of 1975, after having received the last rites. He was somebody that was thoroughly, instinctively, intellectually, and spiritually Catholic, and succeeded in applying those Catholic principles to his country in his time, and left us a legacy of Catholic thought in a constitution which still remains the Constitution of Ireland. So here is someone that I think can be held up as a model, at least, of Catholic integrity and of effective Catholic action in government. Now, I want to talk about just a couple of other, I've perhaps gone a bit too long on De Valera, but I want to talk about a few other statesmen while we're here. All of you have seen a picture. You've seen it in history books, you've seen it in television documentaries, you've seen it in magazines and periodicals and videos. It's a still photo of a film that was taken at the Yalta Conference in 1945, and you see a visibly ill, visibly dying Franklin Roosevelt with sunken cheeks, hunched shoulders, a cape over his shoulders, a cigarette dangling from his fingers, perhaps an ill omen for someone who suffered from both hypertension and congestive heart failure. To his left, you see, fingering a cigar in his mouth, a rather unhappy and reflective Winston Churchill, who is perhaps reflecting on what his role in history will be after the catastrophe of this conference of Yalta. And to the right of Roosevelt, you see sitting there serenely, morosely, with a certain smug self-satisfaction, this sinister figure, one of the great criminals of history, Joseph Stalin, one of the great mass murderers of history. In 1962, when the battleship Massachusetts was given by the U.S. Navy to the Commonwealth and moved to Fall River, a war museum of World War II was established inside the battleship, and they carefully cropped the picture of Stalin out, leaving only Roosevelt and Churchill. This is an injustice, because it's not only rendered the picture inaccurate in detail, but inaccurate in essence. For Yalta was Stalin's great victory. Poland had been betrayed. Catholic Eastern Europe had been betrayed. The Allies went to war in 1939 to preserve the independence of Poland. And at Yalta, they gave it away to Stalin. They allowed the recognition of the so-called Lublin government, a quisling Soviet communist satellite government, to displace the legitimate constitutional government of Poland that had gone to war with Germany in September of 1939. Churchill, to his credit, I think, suffered some anguish over this. Roosevelt was sublimely indifferent, worried only about the Polish vote in America. This, according, by the way, to Churchill's own memoirs. Stalin was the great victor. There was one Catholic voice that criticized this among the governments of Europe. This Catholic voice said that, I think an entirely accurate remark, said that Europe was not represented at Yalta, meaning, of course, Christendom. Catholic Christendom was not represented at Yalta, while decisions were made about the great Catholic states of Central and Eastern Europe. The decisions were made by two Protestant, Anglo-Saxon Protestant Freemasons and one communist, or if you prefer, by two atheists and one Protestant, because Winston Churchill, you know, wrote to his mother in the 1890s that he didn't believe in the Christian God or any other God. So, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. This Catholic voice was General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French. Now, de Gaulle is not normally a hero to many conservative Catholics for a variety of reasons, because of Algeria, because of the Cold War, because of the events in France in 1944. But de Gaulle does represent the first Catholic note of dissent on what we call today the New World Order. De Gaulle, by the way, had a very strongly Catholic background that people perhaps are not familiar with. One of his ancestors fought at Agincourt. Three of his ancestors served as crown lawyers for the kings of France in the 18th century. His great-grandfather was imprisoned during the French Revolution. His grandfather, Julien Philippe de Gaulle, was a biographer and an historian who wrote an official history of St. Louis, not the city, the saint. And his father, Henry de Gaulle, was the principal of a Jesuit high school, the School of the Immaculate Conception in Paris, and was dispossessed of his livelihood when, under the law of separation in 1945, the anti-clerical, corrupt, Masonic, liberal French government seized all the Catholic schools and outlawed them and made them part of the state. Young Charles de Gaulle was actually forced into exile across the border to Belgium so he could continue his Catholic education. He served in the First World War, was considered an exemplary and outstanding French officer, was wounded, captured while unconscious, made several escape attempts, Being 6'4", it was difficult for him to pass himself off as inconspicuous in Germany. His escape attempts did not succeed. After the war, he returned to the French army and became a military advisor to the Polish government. And he was one of the military advisors present at the great Battle of the Vistula, where the Black Madonna, Our Lady of Czestochowa, was invoked to defeat the communists. He was one of the French military advisors under General Gamelin that helped the Poles in their fight against the communists. In the 1920s and 30s, he became one of France's leading military intellectuals. Was the author of 2 books on the French army, The Army of the Future, 3 books, The Army of the Future, The Edge of the Sword, and France and Her Army. Many of his ideas were actively studied by Generals Guderian and by a young Colonel Rommel on tank warfare. He moved in many Catholic circles. He knew Charles Marat, he knew Pacelli, the Secretary of State, and others, and eventually became seen as one of France's leading military thinkers. In 1939, when France went to war, he was eventually given command of a French one of France's first armored units. At a time when the Germans were advancing everywhere, he counterattacked. The German generals who couldn't believe their own luck, who couldn't believe their own success in the rapid collapse of France, believed that de Gaulle's pinprick thrust was actually the great counteroffensive, and something like 3 Army Corps retired before his small brigade. Hitler threatened to have the officers shot if they didn't reverse direction. De Gaulle eventually ran out of gas, literally, and was forced to withdraw, but not without first inflicting a considerable defeat on the Germans. This victory, at a time where nothing but defeat and collapse were all about him, resulted in his appointment as Undersecretary of State for National Defense. Now, the Prime Minister at the time, the Premier, was the Secretary of State for National Defense, which meant de Gaulle, as Undersecretary, effectively became the French Defense Minister. In the last days before the final surrender of France, de Gaulle, who advocated continuing the war from North Africa, feared that he might be arrested by the government and boarded a British plane and landed in London, where he gave a famous address on the 18th of June, 1940, asking Frenchmen to rally to him. Now, the French government surrendered in 1940 after, as I said, a massive military defeat. This government at Vichy was the constitutional government of France. There was no doubt about that. It had been established. It was not imposed on them by Germany. It was established by the Parliament of the French Third Republic. But nonetheless, it was constrained by the very nature of the circumstances it was in, and suffered under the double burden of both defeat and a German occupation that became increasingly rapacious. De Gaulle eventually organized his Free French movement and attempted to gain control in various parts of the French Empire and allow these portions of the French Empire to be liberated from a government that was subservient to the Germans. And Brazzaville in the Congo, the states, the French Oceania, French India, and others would eventually rally to de Gaulle. Because of British intervention, he would end up controlling eventually Syria and Lebanon and the Levant. Now, as time went on, it became apparent that the whole French Empire, the whole French colonial regime, would eventually come into de Gaulle's hands, into the hands of the Free French, who were, by the way, identified themselves very strongly with the faith at the time. The symbol of the Free French, of fighting France, was the Cross of Lorraine, the ancient symbol of Joan of Arc. And this, of course, had a double meaning, because it not only was a very profound Catholic symbol, but it was also a reminder of the lost province of Lorraine, which had been captured by the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, and returned to the French after 1918, but the Germans seized it again in 1940. The head of the Free French Navy, by the way, was a Carmelite friar. He was a retired naval officer who entered religious orders. He petitioned the Pope for permission to resume his military career. Pius XII, then, I guess, would have been Pope, granted it, and he became D'Angelo became the head of the Free French Navy. Now, de Gaulle was a useful tool to the British insofar as they were working against the Vichy government, which had been, as I said, had been under German occupation indirectly up to 1942, and direct German occupation after the Allied landings in North Africa in 1942. The American government was unfriendly towards de Gaulle. Now, part of this was a pragmatic decision on the Roosevelt administration to work with Vichy or to work with the existing powers in France. But it was also a profound suspicion by Roosevelt against what he viewed as the man on the white horse. Franklin Roosevelt was a Protestant. He was a 33rd degree Mason. He's the man who gave us our first Masonic majority on the Supreme Court. By the time his administration ended, a majority of U.S. Supreme Court justices were Masons. he was hostile to Catholic culture, and he was an anti-Catholic bigot, and that's not overstating the situation. There's a famous episode recorded by the Jesuit historian James Hennessy that when talking to one of his Catholic aides, Roosevelt at one point blurted out, "You have to understand, you people are here on sufferance. This is our country. This is a Protestant country." His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, the Marxist of perverted appetites, would often whisper in Roosevelt's ear when he was appointing somebody, "Do you know that he's a Catholic? Did you know that, Franklin?" James Michael Curley once made the point that all of the people that Roosevelt injured or betrayed, Alfred E. Smith, Postmaster General James Farley, Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, Curley himself, Thomas Dodd Sr., he said were all Catholics. Curley found that to be more of a coincidence, or less of a coincidence, I should say. Roosevelt was somebody that was that could not comprehend de Gaulle. He thought de Gaulle wanted to be a dictator. He did not understand someone that whose instincts were Catholic, whose instincts were traditionalist, whose instincts were European. You know, it's in our histories of the Second World War, we perhaps don't realize the extent to which the British and American governments treated the lesser allies as essentially cannon fodder, as essentially subservient states. You know, Churchill used to send by surface mail, by boat, war reports to the Dominion Prime Ministers of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa about the deployment of their troops. It usually take about 6 weeks to get to them by a slow steamer. When the Australians demanded of Churchill the return of one of their divisions after the Japanese ran through Malaya, Churchill told them blandly, "We don't have the shipping. I'm sorry." It was when the Prime Minister of Canada had the temerity to want to attend a conference between Roosevelt and Churchill that was being held in Quebec, which the last time we looked was in Canada. Churchill thought it was inexpedient for him to do so. The Americans might want to bring the Brazilians. The Americans and the British, Roosevelt and Churchill particularly, were the rulers of the Western world, and they believed that the lesser allies should be treated like children. They would be taught to obey, and they should, and if for any reason they were impudent or impertinent, they would be sent to bed without their supper. De Gaulle refused to concede this. He conceived of himself as the leader of a great country, a great Catholic country, and would not be treated, would not be patronized, would not be condescended to, would not be treated as the leader of Luxembourg, so to speak. This brought him into continual conflict with both Roosevelt and Churchill, who, of course, did not really want a strong France. But Roosevelt eventually consented to see de Gaulle. And it's very, very interesting, the nature of this meeting. This was after, by the way, Pius XII consented to see de Gaulle. And that lifted de Gaulle's political stature because this was before the liberation. De Gaulle keeps a record of his, or makes a record of this meeting with Roosevelt that occurred in 1944. And it's very, very prophetic in terms of what we're talking about today. You know, many American conservatives disliked de Gaulle because of the Cold War. They saw him as insufficiently supportive of America in its struggle against Soviet communism. But now, as communism has passed and we're confronted with this new world order in which America is the permanent gendarme, you might say, of the rest of the world, it's very, very interesting what Charles de Gaulle wrote in the 1940s about his meeting with Franklin Roosevelt. He said that Roosevelt intended a permanent system of intervention for which he intended to institute by international law. A permanent system of intervention which he intended to institute by international law. It is mined a four-power directory: America, the Soviet Union, China, and Great Britain, this is nationalist China, would settle the world's problems. A parliament of the Allied nations would give which is of course the General Assembly of the UN, a parliament of the Allied nations would give a democratic appearance to the authority of the Big Four. But short of handing over the quasi-totality of the Earth's surface to the other three, such an organization, according to him, would have to involve the installation of American forces on bases distributed throughout the world. Read that to you again. It would involve the installation of American forces on bases distributed throughout the world. And he's writing in the 1940s about American policy. And of course, it's just astonishingly prophetic. Roosevelt, he said, intended to lure the Soviets into a group that would contain their ambitions in which America could unite its dependence. Among the four, he knew that Chiang Kai-shek's China needed his cooperation, and that the British, in danger of losing their dominions, would yield to his policy. As for the horde of small and middle-sized states, he would be in a position to act upon them by the aid he would provide. Lastly, the right of people to decide for themselves, the support offered by Washington, the existence of American bases would give rise to new sovereignties in Africa, Asia, and Australasia, which would increase the number of states under obligation to the United States. In such a prospect, the question relative to Europe, not only the fate of Germany, the destiny of the states along the Vistula and the Danube, as well as that of the Balkans and Italy's destiny, seemed to him quite subordinate. In order to find a satisfactory solution, he would certainly not go to the lengths of sacrificing the monumental conception that he dreamed of turning into a reality. De Gaulle went on to say, I listened to Roosevelt describe his plans to me. As was only human, his will to power was cloaked in idealism. Again, these are de Gaulle's words from his wartime memoirs written in 1946, 1947. They are a roadmap to the current situation where America is the permanent interventionary force in the world and where the principles of our founding fathers have been sacrificed for a new conception of diminished sovereignty, multinational institutions, and perpetual American, or as de Gaulle says, permanent American intervention. What was de Gaulle's response to this? He said, it is the West, I told President Roosevelt, that must be restored. It is the West that must be restored. A Roman emperor could have said that. If it does not regain its balance, and the rest of the world, whether it wishes or not, will take it for an example. If it declines, if the West, meaning again Catholic Christendom, declines, barbarism will ultimately sweep everything away. Now, Western Europe, despite its dissensions and distress, is essential to the West. Nothing can replace the value, the power, and the shining examples of the ancient peoples of Europe. So again, there are many, many problems with Charles de Gaulle from a conservative standpoint, even perhaps from a Catholic standpoint. But in this matter, he spoke as a citizen of Christendom, as a citizen of the Catholic West, of the Catholic Europe, against this emerging New World Order. De Gaulle served only 2 years in France, from 1944 to 46, when he abruptly left because he said France was returning to its parliamentary vomit. He was not an admirer of like many conservatives, of representative institutions. Hilary Belloc said he said all representative assemblies are more or less corrupt, rather more than less. De Gaulle came back to power in 1958 during the Algerian crisis. Now, many conservatives are also very critical of de Gaulle in this point because of the fact that he ended up sacrificing Algeria, that he allowed Algeria to become independent. And that was a loss for the West, not only because Algeria, while not entirely allying herself with the Soviet bloc, was certainly sympathetic in many ways to the states, to Soviet foreign policy objectives, but because 1,360,000 European Catholics ended up fleeing from Algeria. This was certainly a great defeat for Western civilization, for Christian civilization. At the beginning of the 1950s, there were more than 2 million Catholics living in North Africa. Today, there are perhaps 25,000. Still, de Gaulle understood that you could not inevitably hold a country against the will of 85% of its inhabitants. Now, had Europe been organized on Catholic principles, Europe could claim, as the Republic of Ireland does with Ulster, that this was historically Catholic European territory that had been ethnically cleansed and replaced with Muslims. But Europe in the mid-20th century was not organized on Catholic principles. It was organized on secular and democratic principles, and those democratic principles precluded the continuation of colonialism. De Gaulle thought briefly of regroupment, which was to partition Algeria between French and Algerian and Muslim sections. But he thought this ultimately would ultimately fail. And of course, you'd end up with another Northern Ireland in Algeria. He did not countenance the continuation of the existing French colonial rule in Algeria, saying that we could not have another South Africa in North Africa, that is to say a state based entirely on minority rule. I would point out, again, at a time when we are so concerned about the Islamification of Western Europe and about the large number of Muslim minorities in emblematically Catholic countries, such as France and Spain and Italy, who threaten the demographic future of those countries, de Gaulle actually was correct here in his assessment of Algeria. Had Algerian integration, as it was called, been undertaken, where the Algerians were given full rights and allowed to vote, the Algerians today would be 40% of the population of the French Republic. Remember, there was 40 million Frenchmen in 1960, about 1.3 million French living in Algeria, and about 8.5 million Muslims living in Algeria. Today in Algeria, there are 37 million Muslims, and perhaps another 4 to 6 million Muslims living in France. So had de Gaulle not opposed the conservatives in his own party at the time and gotten out of Algeria, you could conceivably have a situation where in a united, integrated French-Algerian state, there would be in excess of 40 million Muslims which of course would destroy France as a Catholic country and destroy France as a country of the Western Alliance. So we perhaps might want to give de Gaulle some credit there. I just make one point. He was also very, very critical of Anglo-Saxon rule in Canada, and of course wanted the independence of Quebec. He talked about it in many ways that remind one of Irish Catholics who are seeking here in Massachusetts to ingratiate themselves with the traditional Protestant culture. He talked about the Catholics that play the federation game, and for their own economic interests, deny their heritage. But he said the French in Canada were a miracle of, as he put it, fidelity, and the French Catholics of Canada were a miracle of fidelity and fecundity, which was a great, I think, remark of a Catholic nationalist. Now, I also just want to talk, we have only a little bit of time, and I would like to take some questions, but I want to talk a little bit about Francisco Franco and Kaiser Karl before we close. In 1975, at St. Ignatius Church at Boston College, which is the parish church of Boston College, an institution now largely in apostasy, and by the way, a very beautiful church that one hasn't been quite entirely disfigured or vandalized by liturgical changes, a church that has the marvelous stained glass windows that speak to the history of the Society of Jesus, including a particularly exquisite one which shows St. Ignatius of Loyola kneeling before Pope Paul III, where Pope Paul III proclaims, looking at the constitutions of the Society of Jesus, Digitus Deus, the finger of God. In that church, in 1975, there was a memorial mass, November of 75, which I was present for a Catholic head of state. Yet no Catholic official, no ecclesiastical official of the Archdiocese of Boston or of nearby Boston College attended. It was for a head of state who was a treaty ally with the United States. But no American official, local, state, or federal attended. And though he represented a country that, for which the heritage and language of tens of millions of Americans can be traced to, the crowd was pathetically small, even minuscule. It was a memorial mass for the head of state, the Caudillo of Spain, Generalissimo Francisco Franco. Franco, even in his own funeral in Spain, by the way, that funeral was boycotted by all of the heads of state of Europe, who made then an ostentatious show of coming to the installation of his successor, the new king, Juan Carlos. I remember at the time various newspaper columnists and cartoons carried on a great caricature and derision of Franco. Many people, it became a running joke on the television program Saturday Night Live, his death. I remember my Protestant history professor at Boston College saying that though he didn't believe in hell, he hoped that would be an exception in Franco's case. Franco was derided as a war criminal, as a Nazi collaborator, and as a fascist dictator. Franco was none of these things. Franco was a Catholic patriot, he was a hero, and he was one of the saviors of Christian civilization in our century. Franco accomplished something that perhaps Pinochet, I don't know, virtually no one else in the Western world accomplished in the 20th century. He stopped dead in its tracks a communist revolution. And he stopped it with very little foreign help. He had some Italian troops, he had some financial aid from the Germans and the Italians, but that was far outweighed by the aid that the Soviet Union gave to the Spanish communists, and the aid that unofficially the American and British governments allowed to flow to the Spanish socialists and Spanish communists. You know, today we're reading a great deal about, or seeing on television what's going on in Zimbabwe, where under Robert Mugabe's dictatorship, these African farmers are simply seizing the lands of the former, the white settlers there that had comprised the minority government. One can feel a certain sympathy for them. They were victims of a rapacious imperialism led by a predatory homosexual named Cecil Rhodes a century ago. But still, an agreement was made to protect the rights of the white farmers when independence occurred. And it's wrong for this to happen. And of course, we understand instinctively that the sign of any civilized government is the willingness to extend to its people the protection of law. I'm not talking about it in a Whig sense, the protection from arbitrary government, but the sense of protection from mob violence, from theft, from murder, from physical assaults on your person. The Spanish government, though technically a democracy in the 1930s, a legitimate, quote-unquote, elected government, refused to extend the protection of law to its own citizens. It allowed hundreds of Catholic churches and cathedrals and abbeys and convents and monasteries to be burned. It allowed its political opponents to be murdered in the streets, newspaper offices to be smashed, newspapers torn up and destroyed. And ultimately, it allowed the murder of 6,900 Catholic nuns, priests, monks, friars, seminarians, including 13 Catholic bishops. The Spanish government, though elected, had lost all legitimacy, and a general named Francisco Franco, who was one of the most capable generals in the Spanish army, the youngest general in Europe since Napoleon, one of the founders of the Spanish Foreign Legion. Yes, there's a Spanish Foreign Legion besides the French Foreign Legion, and it still exists today. It defends the last two Christian outposts in North Africa, Melilla and Ceuta, and was the superintendent of the Spanish Military Academy. This man eventually joined the revolt against this illegitimate, though elected government that refused to protect its own citizens, and in a bloody 3-year civil war succeeded, despite massive shipments of aid and arms from the Soviet Union, in defeating the communists. It was unprecedented. Think of all the countries that were simply mowed down, that were bulldozed over by the communists in the 20th century. China, the most populous country in the world, perhaps the largest geographical country in the world, Russia, so many states of Eastern Europe, states of Africa and Asia, Cuba and Latin America, yet here's one man who succeeded in defeating the communists, and that's the real reason that he's treated with such disdain and treated with such hatred today, even to this day. I just want to say a few words about Franco and the Second World War. Winston Churchill paid tribute to Franco on the floor of the House of Commons against attacks made suggesting that Franco was a collaborator with Hitler. And Brian Crozier, who was the famous Protestant historian, used to write for National Review a number of years ago, actually said Franco was one of the people most responsible for the Allies winning the Second World War. And the reason he said this is because, first of all, had the Republicans, had the communists, the syndicalists, the socialists won in the Spanish Civil War, Hitler would have certainly, once he finished with France, overrun the Pyrenees frontier and invaded Spain, grabbed Gibraltar, closed down the Mediterranean, cut off Malta, and would have prevented any Allied landings in North Africa. He also points out that a government less capable than Franco, that was not as strong as Franco, would have acceded to Hitler's demand to allow the transit across Spanish territory to seize Gibraltar. It was Franco's strength, his capacity, his control of the country, the loyalty that he received from the church and from the armed forces and from the populace that allowed him ultimately to resist Hitler and also to deceive Hitler. Winston Churchill, by the way, makes a famous remark about Franco. He said that Franco hated and, he disliked and feared Adolf Hitler. And then he went on to say Franco also liked, but didn't particularly fear Benito Mussolini. Franco's method of dealing with Hitler was not open resistance or open defiance, because he knew that the panzers and the Stukas and the U-boats would simply overwhelm his country, and he had a poor country that just fought a civil war. His method of dealing with Hitler was to agree with everything Hitler said, and then make impossible demands on Hitler for support and for aid. In fact, he would ask his military personnel, Hitler wants us to do such and such. Now, what will it take to do that? And they would give him a very, very accurate estimate. And then he would immediately multiply that by 4. And then he would go back to Hitler and say, well, we need 2 trillion gallons of oil if we're going to do that. And we actually, can you give us a heavy cruiser, by the way? Certainly Germany makes 400 millimeter guns that we can use to shell Gibraltar. And Hitler, we're not quite sure whether Hitler actually realized what was going on. He certainly had his suspicions. Now, bear in mind, Adolf Hitler was a man that turned German field marshals, tough Nazi apparatchiks, and foreign diplomats into whimpering, withering incoherence. When Hitler met with Franco at Hendaye on the 23rd of October 1940, Hitler came away and said, I have a terrible headache. I'd rather have all my teeth pulled than ever meet with that man Franco again. And Franco extravagantly praised Hitler, by the way, all during the meeting. Franco was very, very careful in the Second World War. When he asked, did he ever think about joining the Nazis or joining the Axis, he said never. No, of course, they were barbarians. The German ambassador had no illusions, by the way, about whether Franco was sympathetic to the Nazis. He called Franco a clerical reactionary. You know what that's code language for? He was Catholic. It was Franco, by playing Hitler off, by outmaneuvering Hitler, he became non-belligerent at one point, which was more than a neutrality, which showed that he basically favored the Axis side. But again, on paper, he sent the Blue Division of volunteers to fight on the Russian front against the communists. But he explained afterwards that was simple. That was the simple wish of so many people in Spain to avenge themselves on the people that murdered their own family members. Then withdrew it as time went on. Eventually became neutral again. And at the end of the war, kept Spain out of the war, kept Spain from the terrible bloodshed, and in effect helped the Allies. And Churchill mentions this again on the floor of the House of Commons. He said, you know, he could have intervened at the time of the North Africa landings, could have intervened before that. He would make all sorts of impossible demands to the Germans for French territory, knowing that they would never receive it. He was assisted in this by Admiral Canaris, the chief of German intelligence, who knew Franco from the time of the First World War, and who constantly told Franco that Hitler was unbalanced, and which Franco, a notion that Franco readily accepted. Nonetheless, so Franco is one of the people that actually, by maintaining his neutrality, but at the same time, by feigning a pro-Axis position, prevented his country being invaded. Now, there are some Catholic historians like Warren Carroll who have criticized Franco for not being more Catholic and supporting the Carlist political party and supporting his own phalange. I tend to disagree with Carroll on this, and one point I'll make quickly, which is that Franco understood that to resist the Nazis and to resist what was going on in Europe in the Second World War, he needed a strong, centralized state with a strong army under his control. The Catholic Party in Spain, the Carlists, were what we call in European politics particularists. That is to say that they believed in a regional kind of federal solution, a weak central government. Franco couldn't endure that. He needed a strong Spain, a strong centralized state for the emergency that he faced. And I think his judgment was sounder than theirs and sounder than Warren Carroll's on this point. Franco was ostracized after the war. The United Nations urged all civilized countries to withdraw diplomatic representation from his country, from Madrid. This confirmed Franco's power in Madrid as hundreds of thousands of people rallied in front of him to proclaim his support. It solidified his identification with Spanish nationalism. Franco was wonderful when it came to the Catholic faith. Very simply, he was one of the strongest Catholic statesmen of the 20th century. You had a secular republic that had seized church property, dissolved religious orders, suppressed Catholic schools, banned religious instruction from state schools, legalized divorce. Franco returned crucifixes to the classroom. He returned chaplains to the army. He returned the property of the church to the various religious orders, reopened Catholic schools, had Catholic instruction in state schools, tightened laws against divorce. There was, of course, no issue of abortion or contraception in those days, gave the church a complete freedom of action in the social sphere, had close diplomatic relations with the Holy See, and eventually signed a wonderful concordat with the Holy See, which many liberals in the Vatican are still trying to live down, but which was a vindication of Catholic principles of society. He did not believe in religious freedom, being a traditional Catholic. He thought that the Protestant minority could enjoy freedom of worship in their own homes, but should not make public manifestations of heresy, that a Catholic state has the right to defend itself and defend the faith of its people. And Franco lived to old age. He was nearly 83 years old when he died in 1975. He preserved his regime. Again, Carroll and some other conservative Catholic historians say that perhaps he could have done more, but I think in the end, his regime was overwhelmed by the changes in the church and by the liberalization of Catholic culture and by the triumph of heresy from within the church, not only from without. He remained true to his Catholic faith. He and his wife and his daughter said the rosary every night. And when he died, he left a wonderful will, which is, by the way, reminiscent of Napoleon's will. He said, "I die in the one holy Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman Church into which I was born." He warned Spain to watch for the enemies of Spain and the enemies of Christian civilization. You know, we talk about the West nowadays. Franco never talked about the West. He talked about Christian civilization. He was referred to sometimes as the Roman Spaniard because his attitude was so much, not only so Catholic, but so reminiscent of Roman emperors like Charles V, who was also the King of Spain. He was one of the great Catholic statesmen of the 20th century. I'll make a brief point also about his close collaborator, Antonio Salazar, who was the ruler of Portugal. Actually, not the ruler, not the president. He was the finance minister and later the premier, and who guided the destinies of Portugal for many, many years. Salazar was a great student of Rerum Novarum and tried to implement Catholic social principles. And like Franco in Spain and like de Valera in Ireland, took a dim view of representative assemblies and believed in a vocational approach to politics where instead of class warfare, we would have a representation of all vocations. De Valera did this in Ireland with the Irish Senate, which is not elected on a party basis, but elected on the basis of various vocations. Franco did this in Spain in terms of some of its representative institutions, and Salazar did this in Portugal. His solidarity with Franco, referred to as the Iberian Bloc, was a great support on the flank of Franco and helped probably Franco maintain his traditional status and the traditional status of Spain and a Catholic regime in Spain. Salazar also opposed the decolonization of the Portuguese Empire as he believed that the people themselves did not want decolonization. He believed firmly that a majority in Goa, in India, were Catholic and identified themselves with the culture of Portugal and did not wish to be associated with the Indian state under Nehru. He hoped the West would come to his aid. This was, of course, the era of the Kennedy administration, and he was disabused of this, of course, when the Indians seized control of his country. He was utterly opposed to giving up Angola. That struggle, as we know, is still on today. The Portuguese left, of course, in 1974. Dr. Jonas Savimbi, who was sadly killed recently, carried on an anti-communist struggle. That struggle is not yet over as to whether the communists will end up controlling, despite their support from Gulf and other major oil industries, the largely Catholic people of Angola. So Salazar was also one of the really truly great. He became finance minister in 1927, premier in 1932, and governed the destinies of Portugal until his death in 1968. We're coming very close. I want to talk about Kaiser Karl. I think Gary said he mentioned him earlier today. I'd make one last point before we take some questions about Venerable Kaiser Karl. We have not only a Catholic hero, but a great Catholic, a Catholic whose cause is up, whose body was incorrupt, and whose cause is he's now Venerable Kaiser Karl, the last Austrian emperor and last king of Hungary. Austria-Hungary was the last Catholic great power. It was a country of more than 50 million people that comprised what is now the modern-day states of Austria-Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, the Transylvanian part of Romania, the Tyrol and Trent from Italy, and Ruthenia, the Western or Catholic Uniate part of the Ukraine. It was not a representative or democratic state by modern norms, but most states at its time were not either. But it was an inherently civilized state and a profoundly Catholic one. It had a benign, moderate, prudent government. It did not oppress its people. It did not heavily tax its people. It spent less on armaments than any other country, major power in Europe. It was the last country to introduce conscription, the draft. Its people were well fed, and it had a marvelous culture based on defending the Catholic faith and preserving the Habsburg monarchy. It was the country, the empire that gave us Baroque architecture, the waltzes of Franz Joseph Strauss, and the very civilized custom of putting whipped cream in one's coffee. So it was Catholic civilization at its height. Karl came to power at the age of 29. Again, by the way, they were all of the same generation. If you look at Franco, if you look at Kaiser Karl, if you look at de Valera, if you look at de Gaulle, they all come from this period, the 1880s, the 1890s, a wonderful generation of Catholic statesmen. He was born in 1887, came to power on the death of Franz Joseph in 1916, faced a nearly impossible situation, lost his throne and his empire and his dynasty after only 2 years. Why should we celebrate someone who was not a political success? Because we're Catholics, and the highest law of the church is the salvation of souls, and here's a man who did finish the fight and finish the race and kept the faith and died in the odor of sanctity as a Catholic, but also demonstrated great virtue as a Catholic ruler. You know, blessed are the peacemakers. Karl was a peacemaker. He sought an honorable negotiated end to the First World War. He said he did this not only at a time of raging nationalism, he did this not only for his own people, but for all the Catholic people, all the peoples of Europe for whom he felt responsible. This was the successor, of the temporal head of Christendom, the successor of the Holy Roman Emperors. He was prepared to make generous concessions to the Allies. The Allies were interested in using him. The Allies did not want a negotiated peace. They wanted a separate peace. They wanted to detach Austria-Hungary from Germany and then crush Germany. So that they did not, Karl was prepared to negotiate in good faith. The Allies did not negotiate in good faith. Karl was, blessed are the merciful. Karl was merciful. He was always willing to grant a pardon or a commutation to someone convicted, even at times of capital crimes. He was someone that was an exemplar of Catholic family life, who was a faithful husband and a loving father, besides being a father to all of his people. He was an idealist. Think, by the way, of the overthrow of all the empires at the end of World War I. What a tawdry story, the unedifying story of Nicholas II and Alexandra, and the occultic obscenity of Rasputin that ends eventually, of course, in the vicious murder of an entire family in a basement in Siberia. Think of the end of the Hohenzollern's in Germany, where an obstinate refusal to go ended up threatening the very survival of the monarchy, and then it's followed by a panic-stricken flight. Wilhelm II, by the way, recovered his reputation somewhat after the war, but then made the imprudent and capricious gesture of congratulating Hitler on the conquest of France, and then ruined it all again. Karl died a a person of integrity and character, a loyal and sincere Catholic. He attempted to come back twice after the end of the war to Hungary, but was thwarted in that and died at the age of 35 on the island of Madeira. The United States played a key role in the breakup of Austria-Hungary. Woodrow Wilson insisted that he would not negotiate with Charles because he was not the elected representative of the people, because it was a multinational monarchy. This had much to do with Wilson's detestation of the Catholic faith. By the way, Wilson is the man who said we wanted self-determination for all nations, but one nation that never got self-determination and that Wilson wouldn't talk to was Ireland. In fact, he told one of his secretaries that nothing gave him more joy than to tell the Irish to go to hell when they came to see him. And he used that term, go to hell. Wilson declared war on, got the Congress to declare war on Austria-Hungary in December of 1917 and made it an Allied war goal. Now, Winston Churchill, in his history, 6-volume history of the Second World War, points out that Lloyd George was negligent in not standing up to Wilson on the issue of Austria-Hungary, not because the British were sympathetic to the Catholic culture of Austria-Hungary, but the British, being more seasoned and more experienced as a great power than America, saw Austria-Hungary as a bulwark against both Germany and Russia, and saw that the collapse of Austria-Hungary would result in a vacuum filled by either one of the two. And of course, that's what happened. If you look at Czechoslovakia, which came about as a result of the First World War, it was occupied by the Nazis for 7 years, and then it was occupied by the Soviets for 45 years. Look at Croatia and Slovenia. 400,000 people lost in the civil war in the 1990s as they're put under a Yugoslav government at the end of the First World War, the direct result of that. It was catastrophe. A.J.P. Taylor, the English historian, said that the Allies at Versailles thought the Czechs and Slovaks would come together and form a united Czechoslovakia the way the English and the Scots came together to form the United Kingdom. He said there was only one problem. He said the Slovaks turned out to be Irish. So the Versailles settlement was a disaster that has inflicted untold evil on Europe, and which Charles did all in his power to avert. His body was found to be incorrupt in 1972. There's a cause for his sainthood. He is now Venerable Kaiser Karl, and I urge you to pray that he will ultimately be canonized. I don't think we're really going to have a chance to talk about DM or a few other people, but I'd like to, before we stop, I know we've gone a bit late, take any questions if anybody has them. Yes, sir. The gentleman asked why it is that Franco, who is rarely called anti-Semitic but is described as fascist. By the way, he is called anti-Semitic despite the fact that he gave transit visas to Jews to get out of Europe, and despite the fact that he extended Spanish government protection to Sephardic Jews in France. This is, by the way, a great embarrassment in French history, that liberal left-wing French politicians and historians must admit that this allegedly fascist dictator actually did more to protect Jews in France than some of their own people did. Franco, the state of Israel was one of the countries that voted against Franco's admission to Spain's admission to the United Nations. But he is called fascist in the sense that they believed he believed in the same principles as the Nazis and as Mussolini's fascist party. That is to say, an authoritarian state, a state that did not have representative institutions, a state that was neither capitalist nor socialist. But Franco was not a fascist. As I said, the German ambassador, who was someone who might be able to judge fascist standards, again called him a clerical reactionary. Fascism is a term of abuse used by the opponents of Franco to discredit him. What Franco was a Catholic patriot. Yes, sir. The gentleman asked a very good question, excellent question, that between Pétain, who was the leader of the Vichy state, and de Gaulle, who favored Catholicism more. This is actually a great ongoing debate. The Vichy regime was the first regime to embrace the faith after 61 years. For 61 years, from 1879 to 1940, not a single practicing Catholic held a position in the Third French Republic in the cabinet. So the first regime to strengthen church-state relations, to recognize the Catholic role in education, to support Catholic moral principles was the Vichy regime. However, Pétain was not a practicing Catholic. He was actually in an irregular marriage. He married a divorcee in a civil ceremony, and he was later annulled during his premiership. He got an annulment. Franco, however, de Gaulle, rather, on the other hand, came from a Catholic family, was a very strong practicing Catholic, and tended to attract other strong Catholics around him. One of the German words of abuse towards the Catholics at the time was the German occupation authorities in France would refer to Catholics as clerico-Gaullists. Clerico-Gaullists, meaning if you were a Catholic, you had to really be for de Gaulle. Now, in the case of Darlan, who was the military leader of Vichy, again, a very unusual case, came from a French naval family. The French Navy out of Brittany was usually strongly Catholic, yet Darlan was a Republican and an anti-clerical, and he was, his father had actually been a minister in the Masonic Third Republic, which is likely that Darlan's father was a Mason. So even though you had, it's very strange, you had a government, a Vichy government that officially took a more pro-Catholic position, a lot of the Catholics, it did not seem to have many Catholics in high positions of authority. And the Germans, by the way, discouraged Vichy. There were some Catholics in the early Vichy government. The Germans discouraged the appointment of strong Catholics in Vichy. So you eventually have the Catholics. It was a Catholic royalist who was loyal to de Gaulle who assassinated Darlan in 1942. And of course, de Gaulle, after the war, is the one who supports the restoration of state aid to Catholic schools and religious freedom for Catholic schools. So, I mean, the trend in France itself was actually both Vichy, the Fourth Republic, and de Gaulle all took a profoundly more pro-Catholic view than the old Third Republic. Go on, I'm sorry. Yes, sir. Are there any other questions? Yes, madam. Sure. The lady asked two questions. One was about the condition of Ireland today with divorce and de-Christianization, and the other was about the Habsburg Empire and the great role that Austria-Hungary played in the election of St. Pius X. That's true. I'll answer your second question first. Pope Leo XIII, the author of Rerum Novarum, had as his Secretary of State a Sicilian, Luigi Cardinal Rampolla, who was, by all available evidence, a member of a Masonic lodge, who was a traitor to the faith, and he was the favored candidate in the 1903 papal conclave at the time of the death of Leo, and was the first name apparently entered in by the cardinal electors in the conclave. Now, at that time, the Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, as the successor of the Holy Roman Emperors, as the successor of the temporal heads of Christendom, still retained something called the imperial veto over the election of the Supreme Pontiff. And there was you remember that Franz Joseph, who was the great uncle of Karl, and who was a very loyal Catholic, had suffered terribly at the hands of the Masons. His brother, Maximilian, was executed by the Masons in Mexico. His wife, Elizabeth, was stabbed to death, assassinated by radical assassins who may or may not have been tied to the Masonic Lodge. His son became involved with radical revolutionary elements tied to the Masons, eventually committed suicide and murdered his mistress in a double murder-suicide. And of course, his nephew, Franz Ferdinand, would be assassinated also by the Serbs. Franz Joseph received a French priest who had been, a French Jesuit who had been doing research on Rampolla. And this French Jesuit never thought in a million years he'd actually get to see the emperor. But when he presented his information in Vienna, the emperor himself received him and went over it with him and became convinced that Rampolla was indeed a Mason. And he instructed the present pope's predecessor, the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, because southern Poland was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He ordered the Archbishop of Krakow to announce the imperial veto at the conclave of 1903, and that happened, and Rampolla was vetoed by the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow on behalf of Franz Joseph, and a great saint, Pius X, was elected instead. Now, let me just answer your question quickly about Ireland. We talk about that famous episode, famous place in Ireland, St. Patrick's Purgatory. Well, there's a new St. Patrick's Purgatory, and that's the de-Christianization of Ireland. A post-Christian, all of the political parties of Ireland, except one small pro-family party, now essentially support a de-Christianizing agenda. And much of it comes as a result not only of the, de Valera was right, the influence of the British and American media. Ireland has become a secularized Anglo-American cultural province, but it also comes from money from the European Union, which is giving vast amounts of infrastructure funds and commissionerships in the EU. And in return for this, the Irish are being required to legalize sodomy, to legalize contraception. A child can go in and buy contraceptives today in Ireland. The government spent money, taxpayer money, to produce an affirmative result in the divorce referendum. It's a scandal, and it's a great, great, heartbreaking tragedy. So, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Yes, sir. 1845. The gentleman wanted to know about Ireland and the Great Hunger, and I just mentioned the potato famine was 18. The Great Hunger was 18. And the gentleman made the point about the Irish, so many Irish that died and emigrated. From what we can tell, 1 million people died in Ireland. 1 million people emigrated to North America, many of them dying on the way or dying after they arrived. Deer Island is an Irish grave, you know, because so many came off of the so-called coffin ships, which they called coffin ships because of the deplorable conditions. And perhaps another 500,000 emigrated to Britain and to cities like Liverpool, which, by the way, elected a member of the Irish Parliamentary Party in the 1880s. Liverpool, the home of the Beatles, is actually disproportionately Irish. And perhaps another 250,000 to 500,000 emigrated to other parts of the British Empire, to New South Wales, to Australia, to Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, and elsewhere. It was a vast exodus. Ironically, one can say that the modern independence of Ireland is owed to that exodus, because there were only two things the British were concerned about at the time of Ireland's War of Independence. They weren't concerned about their own public opinion, and they certainly weren't concerned about British public opinion. But they were concerned about American public opinion, because they owed a $4 billion debt to the United States from the First World War. And they were concerned about Dominion, Commonwealth public opinion, because the 40% of the British Army was made up of Commonwealth troops. So the Irish presence in America, in Canada, and Australia was actually proved the result of this terrible, terrible disaster in which the British indeed were shipping food out of the country while millions of people were starving, was actually a key factor ultimately in the independence of Ireland. By the way, some may want to know why a conservative Winston Churchill liked Franklin Roosevelt so much, liked the Democrats so much. It's because he didn't get along with the Republicans. See, we had a Republican president in the 1920s named Calvin Coolidge, an old Yankee from Massachusetts. And on the issue, Churchill at the time was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and his principal duty as Chancellor was to try to negotiate the Americans down on the debt issue, try to get the schedule, the interest, and the principal relieved or mitigated a bit. And Calvin Coolidge was an ethnic stereotype, an old Yankee. You owe us $4,282,912.36, and you better pay up. So it was, Churchill hated the Republicans. He hated the American conservatives. Roosevelt opened the checkbook towards them, which is one of the reasons, as I said, this conservative Churchill was so enamored of liberals. Yes, sir, you had a question?
Yes.
I'm not. The gentleman asked about Moshi Shombe from Katanga province in what is now Zaire. I'm not sure as to the answer to that. Maybe Gary Potter knows. Do you know anything about Shombe? My understanding is he ended up breaking with de Gaulle though he was part ultimately of the Belgian Empire in 1960, because that was part of the Belgian Congo. But he did not have close relations with the French Union, which eventually became the predominant power in the area. But that's a good question, and perhaps we will have an answer for you at the next conference. Anyways, thank you. Anyone else? Yes, sir. The gentleman is asking a question about the purge carried out by the French resistance of people involved with the Vichy government in the summer of 1944 in France that occurred both before and after the liberation. That's an excellent question, sir. What happened was this: as soon as it became apparent that the Germans were leaving and that the Vichy regime was coming to an end, the French resistance, which included both Catholic and communist elements. By the way, it's a myth to say the French resistance was under, one of the popular myths of our time is the French resistance were the communists, while the Gaullists were the Catholics. The first resistors were Catholics. The communists were allied with the Germans under this Hitler-Stalin pact in 1940 when France was invaded. And the head of the interior resistance, George Bedeau, was a Catholic. What happened was, however, the resistance contained both Catholic and communist elements and socialist elements and others, and they used the collapse of the Vichy regime, which started in June of '44 with the June 6th invasion at Normandy, to settle old scores and to kill large numbers of people, some of them who perhaps were traitors to France, but many other innocent people who were patriots and conservatives and Catholics and others who did not, who the communists viewed as eventually as a threat. What happened was, when de Gaulle came to power, he was faced with a situation where he had a small army, he had a police force that was loyal to him, that had switched from Vichy to him, but also had these vast armed militias all over the country that he had not yet brought under control. One of the reasons de Gaulle talked to Stalin in '44 was because he wanted to get the communists disarmed, and thought he could play, given the hostility that Roosevelt was showing to him, thought he could play Stalin off against a Roosevelt. What happened was de Gaulle ended up letting the French resistance know that he was putting a cloak of protection over four classes of people: army officers, civil servants, soldiers, policemen, army officers, civil servants, policemen, and Catholic priests. And they were not to be touched by the resistance. But of course that left many others that were still at their mercy. The figures vary. They were as low as 13,000, as high as 120,000. The figure people seem to be coming towards is about 37,000 people were killed. Many of these things had nothing to do, by the way, with politics. Anyone who wanted to get rid of a creditor, a business competitor, a romantic rival, wives shot the mistresses of their husbands and later claimed they were collaborators. So I'm not to trivialize it, but there were many private scores were settled. But many other innocent people were also killed at this time. De Gaulle's government tried 792 people and executed them for treason. And he commuted the sentences of all women, of all minors, and of those where there was an issue of doubt. Laval himself, the premier of Vichy, was executed. Marshal Pétain was commuted to life imprisonment and died in his 90s in 1951. So, good. Yes. Are there any other? Yes, sir. I don't know how their prospects, they got less than 1% in the last parliamentary election, though we did very well, about 21% in the presidential fight. The gentleman is asking about Jean-Marie Le Pen and his prospects in France. It's an inspiring movement. I mean, Le Pen, his flag is the tricolor with the Sacred Heart in the middle. He talks about that he believes in the Europe of homelands, the Europe of Charles de Gaulle, he actually said. He believes that, he said that France should defend, the French government should defend life, nature, and the family. And when he said nature, he wasn't talking about trees or the environment. He talked about marriage and about that as an institution. And he said that France should support the Christian West and should resist this Islamification that was going on. I think it's a very strong Catholic movement, but it may be a case that, not to sound like a Leninist, that the situation might have to get worse for them to gain support. Yes, I'm sorry, the gentleman was mentioning the Abidjan. Yes, Le Pen apparently goes to the gentleman asked about the Abidjan. Le Pen apparently, I understand, supports the traditional Mass, new Archbishop Lefebvre. By the way, I'd make one other point quickly about de Gaulle, if I may, that I just wanted to mention was, all of you remember that famous speech John F. Kennedy gave in Berlin in 1963, where he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," and this was considered a great resistance to the Soviet communism and to the attempts to take over Berlin. That had nothing to do with the communists. When the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, Kennedy was absent without leave. If you recall, they had the conference in Vienna, and Kennedy was actually viewed as so weak that Khrushchev later took the liberty of putting missiles in Cuba because he thought Kennedy was such a pushover. Kennedy went to Berlin and gave the Ich bin ein Berliner speech because of de Gaulle, because de Gaulle was promoting rapprochement, reconciliation between France and Germany, because you had a Catholic government in Germany under Christian Democratic Konrad Adenauer. And the Americans were so upset over this, they actually wired Adenauer and asked him, "Are you leaving the NATO alliance?" So it was actually Ich bin ein Berliner. It was not directed against Nikita Khrushchev. It was directed against Charles de Gaulle. Anyways, any questions? That's right. Yeah. Can we take one last question, gentlemen? Yes.
Could you say a little bit more about
the gentleman is asking about the turn of Franco in probably the mid-1960s to embrace Opus Dei and to embrace the technocrats and to embrace others in terms of a more secularization of the Spanish state. I'm not sure I can give you a comprehensive answer. I think Franco was at that point, the constant charge against his regime was that it did not do more to promote economic development. And I think he was sold a bill of goods that saying by bringing in these people, you're also going to have greater modernization of the economy by creating a secular regime. I don't want to give you an absolutely definitive answer because I'm not sure, sir, but I think there was perhaps, Franco would have been, what, over 70, 71 or 72 when this kind of change in policy came in the 1960s. So at what point was he still the vigorous and solitary leader, or at what point was he more responsive to the collective vision of his subordinates who perhaps did not have the same experience and the same principles that he did? I don't know. That's the great danger of anybody in politics, is who they surround themselves with. And strong leaders often have, we know from painful realities in the past, have men who are time servers, who do not share their principles. So I could perhaps that's again another answer I can give you the next time. Thank you, sir. Gary, thank you all very much.